Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I'm going to talk about why the prevalence of what I call pronoun people, and I call them that because I don't want my video to be hidden by YouTube, why the presence of so many pronoun people in the numbers that they're in current stories shows the death of storytelling itself. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about those storylines and where they come from, but I'm mainly going to talk about the origins of storytelling, Western storytelling itself. Now, I know these kinds of videos don't usually do spectacularly well, but I think it's really important that I get down to the nitty-gritty finally and describe for you why I would say Western storytelling is the ultimate form of storytelling, certainly that we have as of yet. Why it is that way, where it comes from, why I'm always talking about Aristotle and his declaration of what a story actually is, and in the end, why what you see around you as entertainment and storytelling is not an actual story, but is simply propaganda. Now, I know that a lot of you already understand that already, but to delve into the roots of it, into the depths of it, to really understand what is going on, I think is important. So, why am I talking about this? Well, I'm talking about this because Richard over at Comics Matter did a very good video about a comic that came out just last week. It's an X-Men based comic called Marauders. It's the annual #1 for Marauders. And just briefly, I think Richard's video on itself is worth listening to because he talks about how you have the writer taking really rational arguments against the X-Men because they are at present literal racial supremacists and isolationists. And the argument against that in the book is literally put into the mouth of a demon-looking character. So the villain, this demon character, is actually putting forth the rational arguments against this racial supremacy of mutants. Anyways, Richard's video goes well into that, and I think it's worth listening to because he explains exactly what's going on in this storyline. But I want to concentrate on something else he brought up, which he usually brings up in a lot of his videos. It's the fact that you have this team of X-Men characters, the Marauders, and there are, I think, 9 people on the team. And they were not brought together out of any real necessity or out of any real, let's take all this certain kinds of people and put them together. And yet, we have a team of 9 people where 75% of the people on the team are pronoun people. And this is not something which is peculiar within Marvel and DC, the 2 big comic publishers right now. You have, in many Marvel books certainly, about 50% of the people or more being pronoun people. In DC, all of the major heroes have now been turned into pronoun people. The new Superman, the son of Superman who has replaced Superman, he's a pronoun person. You have Tim Drake, the most prominent Robin, he's a pronoun person. You have Wonder Woman, she's being turned into a pronoun person. You have the new Aquaman, he's turned into a pronoun person. All of this is going on over and over again. And this breaks storytelling itself. Because, as Aristotle said, a story is a reflection of reality, and I'm going to go deep into that in a few minutes. But the point being that if you thought about this situation for more than 5 seconds, you would understand that having more than 50% of the people in your universe being pronoun people, this is a slap in the face to reality. Not only do we know statistically that pronoun people make up about maybe 1 to 2% of the population, but it's just common sense that if you have more than half of the world's population which do not reproduce in the normal sexual manner, then you're not going to have human beings or human society existing for more than a couple of generations. And the point being, what I want to focus on is the fact that the storyline itself is attacking the basis of storytelling. Because the 2 things can be separated. You have the story that you're telling, and you have storytelling itself, and how the structure of storytelling is supposed to go. And this storyline, and storylines like it, where you have a slap in the face of reality, is attacking storytelling itself, because storytelling is a reflection of reality, and this story, and others like it, is in no way a reflection of reality. It is quite literally the opposite of reality. And again, if you thought about it for more than 5 seconds, you would understand that this is not reality. So from that, I want to go deep into the history of where Aristotle gets his ideas from and understand why story is listed as a reflection of reality within Western storytelling and, as I said, how this is the ultimate form of storytelling. So to begin with, I'm going to answer a really simple question. A question of why in the world should we listen to Aristotle anyways? What importance does he have? And indeed, what importance do the ancient Greeks have at all, let alone this one ancient Greek? Well, I'm going to answer that question, hopefully with some speed. First of all, I can almost guarantee you that if it wasn't for Aristotle, you would not be listening to my voice right now. That is to say, you would not have the device that you are using, whether it be a computer or a phone or a tablet or whatever it is you're using, and the internet, by the way, you would not have those things if it were not for Aristotle. What you have in front of you is technology that came out of modern science. Modern science came out of the works of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon and his ideas came out of the Renaissance. And while I'm certainly not the biggest fan of the Renaissance, I do realize what it is and what it has brought to us. And the Renaissance came about because the people of the 14th, 15th, and 16th century were rediscovering the works of the ancient Greeks, especially Aristotle. And yes, I understand that the ancient Greeks were known by the medievals. Certainly you got scholasticism, which I love, coming out of the 12th century. But when you have it's breaking into normal society, not just your schools and your large universities and your theological thinkers, then you have something which is greatly affecting your society or societies. And again, what we have is, with the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the ancient Greek ideas, especially Aristotle, for more than just small pockets of people that are studying it. And this led to the Renaissance, which led to Francis Bacon and his ideas about modern science, which led to modern science, which led to modern technology, which leads to the computer or the phone or the tablet sitting in front of you right now and your ability to use the internet. So quite literally, without Aristotle, we would not have these things. Although I particularly like medieval society, I would have to say that if it wasn't for that great leap forward in technology, the world would still be living in a medieval society. Quite literally, if you look at China right now, a great vast chunk of China still lives in a medieval way. If you look at North Korea compared to South Korea, North Korea is still a medieval society. If you look at Japan and its history, Japan, up until the point where Europeans broke into it, was a medieval society. And it's not just these places. If you look at Russia, and the reason why the revolution took place was because most people lived in a medieval way. And I myself, I am the descendant of Scottish people who were driven off of their lands. And I've read the original documents of the Lord who drove them off their lands. And they drove them off their lands because they thought they were lazy, because they lived in medieval societies. And this was in the 17 and 1800s. And quite literally, I will attest to the fact that when I read these documents, I said, yeah, that's the way people are supposed to live, aren't they? And I said that because that's the way my grandfather lived. That's the way both of my parents were brought up. And they were brought up in North America. Now, you might say it was a backwater part of North America, but it was a medieval society right up until my mother and father were probably in their 20s. Quite literally, there were no paved roads. There were no, certainly, cars or anything of the kind. There was no electricity. There was no indoor plumbing. And this was not just one or two poor people. This was an entire area the size of, Maryland. And the difference between my mother and my father's generation and my generation is I grew up with a gaming console. I grew up with a personal computer. Now, I'm sure most of you would laugh at what I called a gaming console, but at the same time, you can see the massive jump within the technology that has changed the society around me, around you. And again, I would attest to the fact that this technology would not be here if it wasn't for the scientific method, if it wasn't for Aristotle and his rediscovery and the rediscovery of the rest of the Greek thinkers. So yes, these Greek thinkers, especially Aristotle, are supremely important and have a drastic effect on the way that you live right now. And it's not just Aristotle, and it's not just technology. It's also in the culture that we live. One of the key elements of what peeled Western civilization off from other kinds of civilizations was how it viewed law. It is a basis of law that we still have today. And I think one of those major turning points that many scholars would agree with me on was the idea of intent. Now again, hopefully, quite briefly, let me describe this for you and show you how exactly this is supremely important to the world you live in and the mindset that you have right now. There are still today, within the world that we live in right now, a lot of governments out there who don't consider intent in their law system. Now, they're usually in one concentrated area, and they're thought of as ancient civilizations, but they are certainly ancient because they're not Western civilization. They have never taken into them ideas like intent. So, in such places, you have laws where, and excuse me for the crudeness of this example, but it actually paints the picture best if you ask me, where you have a law system where if you have a woman who is walking down the street and she is sexually assaulted, and then after it's done, the police come, and what do the police do? Well, they arrest the woman. Why do they arrest the woman? Well, because she committed an unlawful act, because it was immoral and therefore, under those laws, illegal. So she committed an illegal, immoral act by being assaulted in this way. And so they arrest her. They put her in prison. And I'm sure more than one of you is scratching your head right now going, why in the world would they do this? You're thinking to yourself, she didn't have any intent in this whatsoever. It wasn't her fault because she didn't intend to do this thing. This was done to her against her will. But in these systems, intent doesn't matter. It is her actions, whether or not she intended them or not, that actually matter. And because of her actions, she's going to prison. Quite simply, that's the importance of intent within a law system. And where do we get this idea of intent? Well, it goes back to what I'm always saying, the two parents of Western civilization. They are Greece, most notably Athens, and Jerusalem. Let's go with Jerusalem just for a second. If you read the Bible, the old books of the Bible, I think it's the book of Numbers, they have the setting up of what they call sanctuary cities. And why? Well, they give this example. Let's say you and your best friend are out in the woods cutting down trees. You take your axe and you swing it up above your head to chop the tree, and the axe head comes off it, and it flies up into the air, and then comes down and hits your best friend in the head, killing him. What do you do in that situation? Well, in that situation, you have to flee. Why? Because his family has the legal right to kill you because of what you've done. Now you would say, that's just an accident. Why in the world would they do that? Why? Because there was no consideration of intent. It doesn't matter if you intended to do it or not. You had to flee to a sanctuary city and stay there for what? I think it was 7 years, and then you could possibly come back to where you were from because they couldn't legally kill you anymore. But again, in that system, intent did not matter at that time. It wasn't until you get to the book of Job where you have a consideration of intent. And at around the same time within Greek civilization, they were coming up with the exact same idea. In Greek civilization, you get it from the story of Orestes. Orestes being the son of Agamemnon. Agamemnon, the man who fought in the Trojan War. And the story being that Agamemnon was off fighting the Trojan War for about 10 years, and his wife, Iphigenia, she took on not a mistress, a male mistress, whatever they're called. Anyways, she took on a man to herself, and they thought, well, he's dead, we're just going to rule. But he came back, and when he came back, they were kind of shocked because they thought he was dead and wanted him to be dead. So what did they do? They planned his death and then killed him. And so his son, Agamemnon's son, Orestes, he then kills his mother because he wants to kill the murderer of his father. But then a force of nature steps in called the Erinyes. Now, the Erinyes are basically a cross between harpies and vampires. And they are the ones who supposedly revenge parents against their children when their children kill them. But you have Orestes, and he flees off to the temple of Apollo, and he begs Apollo and says, please be the judge, adjudicate this case for me, because it was not my intent to kill my mother, it was simply my intent to revenge my father, that is to say, to kill the murderers of my father. And so Apollo looks at the case and says, yeah, it's actually right. He's actually doing right. He avenged the murder of his father. It didn't matter if he killed his mother. His intent was to bring about justice, and that is what matters. And by the way, you have these harpy-like vampire women who don't accept this and then pour out poison from their teeth, which then scorches the earth of everything around them so nothing can grow there anymore. It has a little bit of a parallel, I would say, with what you see around you today. But again, my entire point being that if we didn't have this idea of intent, which came from these two places, one of them from Athens, because we have this story through Aeschylus, who was basically an Athenian. He grew up about 25 miles from Athens. But my point is that these ancient stories that deliver to us the ideas of things like intent shape immensely the civilization around us and the way that each of us think. Because again, I'm sure when I described that scene of the woman who got assaulted, most of you were saying to yourself, well, that's unjust. Well, you're saying that to yourself because, in part, of the stories that we get from ancient Greece. And how those stories help shape our civilization for millennia in consideration of things like intent. So yes, ancient Greek history and ancient Greek philosophy are very, very important and have a massive impact on your day-to-day life. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty and talk about what I just referenced, the fact that we get these things, these ideas coming down to us mainly at one point through storytelling. And that is the storytelling that Aristotle describes around the year 400 BC. And he was working off of stories from 800 BC that were working off of historical events from, at the very basic minimum, 1200 BC and older. So here's the thing about those stories. They are unique, and as I said, I think the most durable and the best way of storytelling that human civilization has come up with. And for a very specific reason, and that specific reason is the history of Greece itself. So, some of you may not know that there was a Greek Dark Ages. That is to say, there is a massive difference between the Greeks of Athens and Sparta and the Mycenaean Greeks and the people before them even, the Mycenaean Greeks being the people who fought the Trojan War. And if you go back farther, the people where you would get the stories of Jason and the Argonauts, or Heracles, or Athena, all of which were probably at some point real people. So the thing is that between those periods in Greek history, there was a Dark Ages. And we don't even know where this Dark Ages came from. We have no clue. And as a quick aside, just as a reference back to the original material, which started me thinking about this, where did it come from in the Marvel Universe? It came from Apocalypse, that former X-Men villain who is now one of the key leaders of the mutant civilization. So, a genocidal maniac that caused a Dark Ages thousands of years ago is now one of the supreme leaders of the mutant nation. But here's the thing, back to actual history. When you have this Dark Ages in Greece, what you have is a loss even of the ability to read and write. Now, I'm sure in that Mycenaean period, you didn't have a whole lot of people who could read and write, but you really lost the ability to read and write within the Dark Ages. And it kept on that way until the Greeks started to pull themselves once again out of this Dark Ages, out of this subsistence farming, basically, that they needed to keep themselves alive. But the thing is that these Greek people during this Dark Ages, they needed a system whereby they could continue to be a civilization, where they could continue to have a reference to their civilization, their history, their religion, all of these things that would normally fall away when you had no time for anything except to survive. And I would assert that these are the things that they partly needed in order to survive. Because if you look at Greece right now, you might think of it as something insignificant, but back then, it was a strategic and monetary position that was envied by many people. And so they had to keep this cohesion within their society as much as possible with a common idea of religion and with a common idea of history and culture so that they could continue to defend themselves and remain there in that place. And how did they do that? How did they do that when they had no reading and writing? Well, they did that through storytelling. They had an oral tradition which allowed the history, religion, culture of everything in the Mycenaean period and before that to continue down through the ages, and we're talking about minimum 10 generations of people where they could continue their heritage and become a people of advanced civilization once again. Now, I want to stress something at this point. During this Greek Dark Ages period, they were an oral tradition civilization. But this is an oral tradition civilization, which I would say is different than any other oral tradition civilization that you can point to within history. And the difference being that if you look at other oral traditions, which I have, traditions like North American Indians or even Celtic civilization or Norse civilization, you had them moving from an oral tradition into a more advanced civilization. So quite literally, from barbarism into civilized living. But for the Greeks, This oral tradition was bookended by high advanced civilization, rational civilization. So you had an advanced rational civilization up until a point, and then you had an oral tradition to continue that on through story. Then you had another high advanced rational civilization. So this oral tradition, far be it from coming out of barbarism, where they're just trying to piece together ideas according to the small things that they understand, the Greek oral tradition during their Dark Ages was one based upon a rational understanding of society. And while it may not have been as directly rational as societies like the Athenians, they certainly were able to have immense knowledge of highly rational arts like architecture. When the Greeks in their Dark Ages looked at the architecture that was set up by their ancestors, they were baffled by how in the world people could actually move such massive amounts of stone and build such things. And this is partly where they came up with the idea of, well, they must have been superhuman, because that's the only thing that they could think of, because their ancestors had a rational civilization, a civilization that was built upon understanding that they had since lost because they could only scrape by with the bare minimum that they needed to survive. And this is exactly the point. If you have an oral tradition that is coming out of a highly advanced rational civilization, and it is forged in the fires of necessity and survival, you get a storytelling system which is lean and mean and only conveys exactly what needs to be there. And while, as I have studied other kinds of storytelling, I have seen significant ideas and ways of storytelling in other cultures, in other civilizations, in other parts of European civilizations, none of them come close to this ancient Greek way of storytelling, which again is what Aristotle describes in the 4th century BC and what I am using as my basis of this is what a story is. And again, here's the thing. This is why Aristotle says a story is a reflection of reality. Because, as I said, these people that were dealing with this oral tradition of which he is talking about, where these stories came from, they needed to have something that worked, something that conveyed the information that they necessarily needed to survive in order for it to pass down from generation to generation as easily and quickly as possible. And how do you do that? Well, Aristotle himself came up with a system that describes this within his ideas of logic. He's talking about art according to logic, and he says, art is the way of using a specific system to have your knowledge pass on with the most order and ease as possible. And how does he say that you can move along with order and ease as much as possible? Well, you do it by having all of the things that you're working with, all of the structures, all of the form of what you're trying to convey be based upon what is real. He understood, just like his ancestors understood with their oral storytelling, that the best way for things to actually survive is by working with all of the rules of reality. Therefore, what you're trying to do when you put up any system of knowledge whatsoever is to base it in reality. And as I said, to be more poetic about it, the way that they came up with this idea was the fact that it was forged in the fires of necessity and survival. They could deal with reality as best as possible because they needed it to survive. And so, this is why ancient Greek history is important. This is why Aristotle is important. This is why Aristotle's description of what a story is, according to reason and logic, are important. And again, this is according to what is rational and logical. As I had said previously, you had a high rational civilization going into oral history, going into another high rational society. And by the way, just quickly, I understand that some of these stories that were passed down to them were not strictly rational and had irrational things in them. But when you look at thinkers like Plato, who is the teacher of Aristotle himself, after he goes through what he describes as the laws for the perfect society that should be set up, what is the next thing that he targets? It is storytelling. and how the people of this society should use stories in a correct way in order to teach the citizens what they need to know. And one of those things that need to be done, according to him, is to get rid of all of those vicious strains of thought which have entered into the storytelling over the years. Those things which have corrupted the storytelling. Those things that have crept in that do not comply with his idea of what the ultimate reality actually is, which is the good. And by the way, do you want to know what the very first story that he deals with has as its subject matter? It has, well, the actions of what you would call pronoun people. And how those stories were not being used as a description of a wider reality, but being used by very specific citizenry to justify their actions. Which, honestly, sounds terribly similar to what we see around us today, where you have these quote-unquote progressives using these pronoun people as a tool to get what they want. But back to Aristotle and his definition of what a true story is, according to what is rational. And as Aristotle himself describes for us, the way that you do that, the way that you do things according to reason, is you have to have the first steps of reason in order just to get there. And those first steps are simple apprehension and then judgment. Simple apprehension, which is the first step which is necessary to get to reason itself, is to define a thing as it exists within reality without making any judgments about it. That is to say, simply to describe a thing as it actually is in reality. So yes, reality and a reflection of reality is supremely important. And if you don't have that reflection of reality as the basis of what you are defining, then you're not being rational. So the entire point being that storytelling, as defined by Aristotle, according to this system, is a reflection of reality. And here's where I should point out once again that I'm dealing with science fiction and fantasy, and I always get someone in the comments saying, how in the world is that a reflection of reality? Well, once again, there is a difference between the story and storytelling. The storytelling, the basis of the storytelling needs to be a reflection of reality. And once again, if you look at storytelling itself, as defined by Aristotle, it is a rhetorical argument. That is to say, it's trying to convey some information. That rhetorical argument, if it is to be rational and logical, must be something that is determined by both its form and its matter. The story itself is the matter. The storytelling is the form. You need to have a correct form in order for the story to have any real weight whatsoever. And that correct form is according to reality. And so you can have science fiction and fantasy that's based upon a rational argument because you're using an if-then statement. You're saying, if this was possible, then what would human existence look like in this case? And so you can do things like have science fiction and fantasy based upon an if-then situation, which is a logically rational argument, which is, in this case, a rhetorical argument, which is based upon the formal bedrock of reality. But when you have stories, like I described at the first of this video, where you have these people in it being 75% of something which simply does not exist, and we all know, just if you put 5 seconds of thought into it, can't exist in this way. This is the story itself, the information of the story attacking the form of the story, which is the storytelling, so that what you have in the end is not a story. What you have in the end is propaganda. It is simply propagating the ideas within the story without strictly using storytelling. Sure, they're using rhetorical argumentation in one form or another, but it's based upon what you feel, not upon rationality and a correct way of thinking. And we know this, once again, because if you have a system whereby you are not based in reality, then you can't have simple apprehension. If you don't have simple apprehension, you don't have rationality. And their stories themselves are not based upon reality. Therefore, what they're trying to do is to teach you what they are talking about, is to give you that information, is to propagate those ideas in a way that does not engage your rational mind, but gets around it and teaches it to you in a different way. And that is the 1945 definition of what propaganda is. And just briefly, I want to say, this is not by chance in any way, shape, or form. I have, over the last couple of years, intently looked at a microcosm of this storytelling within Marvel Comics. And they are going in this direction quite specifically. And all I need to prove this is to give you just two examples. When you had Sana Amanat introducing then-sitting President Barack Obama at a speech in the White House. And by the way, if you don't know the connection between the Democratic Party, the White House, and Hollywood and Marvel Comics, you should go back and watch one of my videos called Who is Sana Amanat? I'll link that in the description and let you go and watch that if you don't know what I'm talking about. That's a real eye-opener. But anyways, when this second-in-command at Marvel Comics was introducing Barack Obama, she said quite specifically in her little speech that what, quote-unquote, progressives understand is that there is no such thing as normal. And if you can't have a definition of normal, then how in the world can you be rational? Because you can't go back to a rational definition of what is. And besides that, when she, at various times within her career as a second-in-command at Marvel, did interviews or was talking at a panel at a Comic-Con and it came up, how do you get to work for Marvel? Her statement was always the same. We will come and find you. But the point being that she said, if you have a unique voice, then we will come and find you. So they were looking to hire people specifically that had unique voices so that these unique people could use their unique voices to tell unique stories. That is to say, to present a picture of reality which only they themselves understood. And they do this because of a specific, almost religious reason that I talked about in former videos. It's an idea of eminence. But anyways, the point being is that if you have no such thing as normal, and all of the quote-unquote stories that you are telling are to be told in a way that it has such a unique voice that only the person telling the story can really understand what is being said, this is a complete destruction of the idea that stories are a reflection of reality. Or, to put it another way, is a complete destruction of what they are describing as a story itself. It is not a story because it's not a reflection of reality, not in any way, shape, or form. And they specifically designed these quote-unquote stories to be this way. And here's the really important part of this entire thing. If you look back at those ancient Greeks and how they survived in using this ultimate form of storytelling by preserving their civilization, by being forged in the fires of necessity and survival and reality, and then you look at what today passes as storytelling, and you clearly will understand that this kind of quote-unquote storytelling, this twisting of what storytelling is, into the form where it is nothing more than propaganda, it is seeking to do the exact opposite of what those ancient Greeks did during that oral tradition period. Whereas they tried to preserve their civilization, the quote-unquote storytelling that we get today is meant to destroy. And not only destroy the civilization you see around you today, but the civilization that was built upon all of those ideas that came to us from our ancient history of those Greeks. The ideas of logic and reason that led us to science and technology. The ideas of intent that led us to a just system of laws. And so really, the ideas that helped us cling to civilization rather than to barbarism. And so, if you wish to defend yourself against these barbarians who are once again at the gate, arm yourself with civilization. Arm yourself with knowledge of your own history. Arm yourself with those weapons that were forged by the fires of reality. And ultimately that means arm yourself with logic and reason, or the barbarians will prevail. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.